Okay, so today our discussion is we sort of moved through. There's so many things we could have talked about in this discussion, but we have only a limited set of opportunities to get together, and so we have to hit the main points. And so this is one of those main points, and we're going to be talking about the Matthew chapter 26, the Passover, the Messianic banquet, and the restoration of Israel. We read in the Gospels about the Last Supper, the Passover, and I don't know how much we sort of bring to the table, no pun intended, almost, when we talk about it and understand the background of it. But it's very, very rich from a Jewish perspective. Of course, it's significant all by itself in the sense that traditionally people connected to the initiation of the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist, leading to the events which will result in Jesus's crucifixion and then the resurrection. And if that's all the story that was there, that would be excellent, to put it mildly. But there's even more to it than that. All right, so that's what we want to unpack today, and we'll dive in. All right, so, and again, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and say something. Don't be shy. This is not supposed to be a one-way conversation. I like interaction. Will keep us going. And besides, if you say something I disagree with or I don't know the answer to, I'll just mute you and pretend it never happened. Okay, so here we go. That was a joke. All right, so this is the famous upper room called in Latin referred to as the cenacle. Obviously, it looks nothing like the upper room that we would associate from a first century context, but this is what there is today. This is a Crusader building, a Crusader structure. The architecture is classical Crusader. Before that, it was a Byzantine church. It was destroyed, and then the Crusaders built a church later. And then when Jerusalem was conquered by the Islamic Caliphate, it was turned into a mosque. And you can see, if you can see my arrow, you can see over here on the corner the niche which points us in the direction of Mecca. So it has quite a history, and they removed most of the Christian symbols in the structure, but there are still a few. Of course, when it was recaptured, it was restored in terms of the Last Supper room. But you can see, all you can see today that associated with Christianity, though, is up here on top of the arch, there's a little round piece, and there's another one that's out of view, and they have symbols of Christianity there, and there's something over in the corner that you can't see. But anyway, it has a fascinating history. And according to tradition, on the other side of this wall would have been where the disciples met and experienced Pentecost, or encountered the Lord. But again, that's all very late archaeological evidence we're looking at right now. Anyway, so this is on Mount Zion in Israel. The thing about Mount Zion is that it's moved around to several different places throughout history. But if you went there today, you would find it, Mount Zion, in this lower corner right here, just above the Hinnom Valley. This is the area of the Jaffa Gate that you'd enter at. If it gives you a little bit of perspective, if you've ever been to the old city, we would be like right down here. It's right above the tomb of King David, which of course is not the actual tomb of King David. Nevertheless, that's the traditional site, a fairly late traditional site, but this just sort of gives you some perspective on where the events took place. But there's debate about even that. This is late obviously archaeological evidence. All right, so let's begin by reading the text, Matthew chapter 26. So verses, oh, by the way, and this is sort of the setup of what we'd expect to see. I'll tell you more about this in a minute, but you can see the disciples are sitting around a U-shaped table in a room, which would have been called the triclinium. More on that in a minute. Of course, in real life, they wouldn't have been quite so blurry. Well, that was a joke, but it didn't work. All right. Okay, so here we go. Matthew chapter 26, verse 17. I'm reading from the ESV, but of course, follow along in your own version. Now, on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Where will you have us prepare for you to eat the Passover?" And he said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.' And the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover." Verse 20, when it was evening, here's some clues what's going on. He reclined at table with the 12. And as they were eating, he said, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me." And they were very sorrowful and began to say to him one after another, "Is it I, Lord?" He answered, "He who dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me. Then the Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had never been born." Judas, who would betray him, answered, "Is it I, Rabbi?" And he said to him, "You have said so." Now, interestingly, in the Gospel of Matthew, the only people that referred, the disciples who are loyal to Jesus, never refer to him as Rabbi. It's not true in the other Gospels, but it is true in Matthew. Now, as they were eating, Jesus took bread and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And he took a cup, and when they had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink of it, all of you. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." All right, so like I said, this chapter, Matthew 26, and in the other Gospels, is probably one of the most well-known events. Sorry, it's late here for me. I'm a little slow. One of the most well-known events in the Gospels. And yet, most of us have a fairly superficial understanding of the events that are taking place here. So we want to unpack them. And so we begin with the Passover. Now, a lot of people take it for granted that everybody agrees that this was, in fact, a Passover, but not everybody does. So let's dig into some historical questions first. First of all, what about the date of the Passover? Now, there's some issues here that have to do with the disagreement, or not disagreement, the apparent disagreement between the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the Gospel of John. Now, this is a picture of the Samaritan Passover. Did any of you know that in the region of Samaria, they actually still kill the Passover lambs and sacrifice them and eat them? It's kind of an event. You can actually pay and get a seat and watch what's going on. It's kind of a bloody affair. And the reason I include it is it's a good example of what life was like around this time of the year. You know, we think of biblical events like this as sort of very sanitized, but you get the idea. This was like an industrial strength event where they're slaughtering the animals and they're bringing them and cooking everything. It is a industrial scale kind of event. And today, if you come to Israel during the Passover season, you can watch it actually being done, at least at the Samaritan Passover. All right, well, let's talk about the date of the Last Supper. Now, according to the Gospel of Matthew, in addition to the two other synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus' supper took place on the day the Passover lambs were actually sacrificed, which would be the 14th of Nisan. The Passover meal itself fell on the Thursday evening, and thus the 15th of Nisan, which is on the lunar calendar. Remember, on the lunar calendar, the day begins at night, in the evening. In John's Gospel, the Jewish authorities leading Jesus to Pilate did not enter the praetorium so as to avoid, quote, ritual defilement and to be able to eat the Passover. John chapter 18, verse 28. Now, the trial of Jesus before Pilate takes place, we're told in John, on the day of the preparation of the Passover. Now, again, the issue here is it doesn't line up with the synoptic Gospels. These verses seem to suggest that the trial of Jesus took place before the Passover and that the crucifixion took place when the lambs were being slaughtered for the evening ritual meal on Friday. Now, so what's going on here? So it looks like in John's Gospel, Jesus is actually being presented as the Passover sacrifice when the Passover lambs are being killed. And so usually the argument goes that John is sort of presenting a theological interpretation of the Passover, where the synoptic Gospels are doing more of a actual historical presentation of the event. At least that's the explanation people usually take, or the direction people usually take. So is there a discrepancy between the synoptics and the Gospel of John? So did everybody get that? I shot through that very fast, but was that clear what I'm talking about? Do you see the problem? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John say the Passover lamb is killed before the actual, or that they eat the Passover meal before it takes place in the Gospel of John. And so there's this discrepancy. Well, the term Passover, or Pesach in Hebrew, or Pascha in Greek, has four possible meanings. The first meaning is that it refers to the actual Passover lamb sacrificed on the 14th of Nisan. However, the term Passover, or Pesach, also refers to the actual Passover meal, which takes place in the evening, which means it occurs on the 15th of Nisan. And then there's the Passover peace offering that is sacrificed and eaten throughout the week. So there's the actual Passover meal, which is killed on the 14th and eaten in the evening on the 15th. And then for every day of the week during the Passover, there's another sacrifice that's made, and that Passover is also eaten. And then finally, it's just a sort of a generic term referring to the whole Passover week. So this is the key to understanding what's going on. So how do we solve this problem? The way we solve it is that when the disciples, I think I got out of sequence. Let me see something. Nope, we're good. So the way we solve it is that when John is talking about the Passover meal and the Pharisees come to the house of the governor, and before they've eaten the Passover, they're actually talking not about the Passover meal that's eaten on the 14th, but one of the Passover meals that are eaten during the week, one of the actual Passover sacrifices that takes place during that entire week. So in other words, there isn't a contradiction between the Gospel of John and between the synoptics. John is not referring as much to the Passover that takes place on the 14th. He's referring to one of the Passover's sacrifices that are carried out during the week. Okay, just sort of unraveling that technical quote unquote contradiction. All right, so there's this big debate about whether this was simply the Last Supper or if it was an actual Passover meal. Well, I'll just play my hand right away and tell you that I think it was a Passover meal, but not everybody agrees. But I think the evidence is pretty strong. Of course, here's an original picture of the Passover meal. No. All right, well, so here's a Passover or a quote unquote Last Supper painting from the medieval period. And I have to tell you, this does not really make me want to eat the Passover very much. It looks like they've basically sacrificed a rat there. I'm not sure what that's supposed to be, but it's supposed to be the lamb, I think. And it just doesn't look very Jewish to me at all. And it looks like they're having cheese with their meal and everything. Anyway, I think this is a very poor representation of the Passover, even though I get it's from the medieval period. Well, a Passover would have been eaten in a room looking something like this. Now, this isn't a perfect artist representation, but you get the idea. You can see they're sitting on the floor, or at least low, and they're sitting around a U-shaped table, which was called, or this room was called a triclinium, and this was a very Roman kind of setup, and we see this in many places. And this would have been where you'd entertain people and where they would have had the Passover meal. All right, so why do I say it was a Passover and not just a new invention called the Last Supper? Well, Jesus and the 12 celebrated the Last Supper on Passover night, which leads me to believe it was a Passover. In other words, the night on which the Passover lambs were eaten by the Jewish people. So how could it not be a Passover? The Last Supper took place immediately after the sacrifice of the Passover lambs, and once the disciples had finished preparing the upper room. So again, all this seems to make a pretty clear statement that it was indeed a Passover meal. They ate the Last Supper, Passover, in Jerusalem. Again, a requirement for Jews living in the Second Temple period on Passover. They ate the Last Supper / Passover at night. Again, that's what you do on Passover. Jesus said a blessing over the bread during the meal, which is then explained in terms of its significance. And this is right on track with how we celebrate the Passover meal. Then Jesus said a blessing over the wine during the meal, actually sort of after it. And he explained its significance, again, following the liturgy of the Passover celebration. And then finally, they ended the celebration with the singing of a hymn, the great Hallel of Psalm 118. So all these things are things that you do at Passover. So it's pretty clear, I think, from a historical perspective that this was indeed a Passover meal. All right, so anyway, those are the historical details that I sort of wanted to fly through. But let's slow down a little bit and talk about the theological significance of what's happening during this meal. Well, so here's my question. What significance does the Passover have for the Last Supper and Matthew's theology of Israel? Because these concepts go together. They're actually inseparable. You cannot celebrate the Passover meal in terms of the Gospels, in other words, the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, whatever term you choose to use, without, on some level, invoking a theology of Israel in the Gospels, Matthew's or Luke's or John's. It is all there. And so we're going to try to unpack it and look at it. All right, so what's the theological significance of the event? Well, first and foremost, the Passover meal evoked the story of the Exodus and God's deliverance of the Jewish people from slavery in Egypt. Now, I'm pretty sure if I asked you that question, most of you would have got that automatically, but it needs to be said because it is what the whole event is about. And I just added a bigger picture for effect because I think it's pretty cool. So secondly, the Passover also evoked the nation's memory of Sinai and the ratification of the Mosaic covenant that formally established Israel as a nation. The phrase, "This is my blood of the covenant," clearly echoes the words of Exodus chapter 24, verse 8. This is the blood of the covenant. So we're not just simply thinking about the release from slavery in Egypt. We're actually reliving the formation of the nation. The whole thing is a package, leaving Egypt, finally arriving at Mount Sinai and receiving the Ten Commandments and the sort of official establishment of the nation, even though they're wandering around for quite a while. And then thirdly, the Passover meal also evoked the theme of the eschatological new Exodus. Now, when I say the quote unquote eschatological new Exodus, what do I mean by that? Anybody know? Anybody want to? I think we've talked about it quite a bit during the course of these weeks, but I just want to sort of review. What do we mean when we say the new Exodus? All right, I'll go. Don't worry if you don't want to step up.
It has to be freedom from sin, right?
Yeah, certainly. Certainly freedom from sin, but the pattern that it's evoking is, we'll see in a second, this idea that, you're right, absolutely. It's the idea that just as God delivered the nation but just as God delivered the nation from slavery in Egypt, so now he will once again act to deliver the nation of Israel. So, in other words, we have to realize that, yes, it's all those ideas about forgiveness of sin and redemption spiritually, but it is also quite literally evoking the theme of Israel's future eschatological redemption. So Israel's prophets appropriated the language of the Exodus to describe Israel's return from exile and the inauguration of the Messianic era. So in addition to Jeremiah chapter 31, which is, of course, what a lot of us think about when we talk about the new covenant and the forgiveness of sin, in addition to Jeremiah 31, the new Exodus theme is found in Hosea chapter 2, and Isaiah 10, 11, 40, all through Isaiah, Jeremiah chapter 16, Ezekiel, and Micah. So it's this theme that runs throughout the prophets, and actually it runs throughout the New Testament too, just most people don't want to see it. In the rabbinic material, the Exodus is understood as and here's the key, again, it's understood as a pattern or a paradigm of Israel's future redemption. Many of these texts express the belief that the Messiah would appear during the night of the Passover. So in a statement ascribed to Rabbi Joshua ben Hananiah, who lived around the year 90, we read, quote, "In that night they were redeemed, and in that night will they be redeemed in the future." And that's from a text called Makilta Exodus, which is a commentary on Exodus, chapter 12, verse 42. The Passover is a sign by which God reassures the people that he will send the Messiah to redeem Israel. And again, another rabbinic text, Exodus Rabbah 18:12, "Let this sign be in your hands on the day when I brought salvation for you. On that very night, know that I will redeem you." So the point is that according to rabbinic tradition, early on, the Messiah would return on the night of Passover. Okay, so that's the first big thing we want to think about when we're talking about the Passover, the actual Passover itself, and the Messiah's arrival. But there's a second theme that is tied to this, and that's the theme of the Messianic banquet. Isaiah chapter 25, verse 6 through 8 says this. This is a great verse. I want this on my tombstone. So, if I croak, this is what I want on there. So, verse 6, on this mountain of the Lord of hosts, on this mountain, rather, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food, full of marrow, of aged wine, well refined. And he will swallow up death on his mountain, the covering that is cast over all peoples, the veil that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces, and the reproach of his people, meaning Israel, the Jewish people, he will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. So the idea here is what? That God will provide a feast, not just for Israel, for all peoples, for all the nations, but he will certainly take away Israel's sorrow, in particular, by redeeming them and restoring them. So all these themes sort of swirl together. And this is the basis where we get this theme of the Messianic banquet. And we see it in the Qumran literature, we see it in rabbinic material, and of course we see it in the New Testament. Matthew chapter 8, verse 11. Now, in this verse, Jesus informs his disciples that, quote, many will come from east and west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. And as I said, this is the Messianic banquet, just we're usually not sort of aware of it when we're reading it. Now, there's a rabbinic text that sort of also has this theme of the Messianic banquet. Now, this one's a little long, so I'll read it. Don't get lost in the weeds. I'll explain its significance in a minute. Here we go. So the Holy One, blessed be he, will make a great banquet for the righteous on the day he manifests his love to the seed of Isaac. After they have eaten and drunk, the cup of blessing will be poured and offered to Abraham, to our father Abraham, that he should bless, but he will answer them, I cannot bless because Ishmael issued from me. So Abraham says, I can't do it, because I carried on. Then Isaac will be asked, take it and bless. I cannot bless, he will reply, because I married two sisters during both their lifetimes, whereas the Torah was destined to forbid them to me. So he can't do it either because he shouldn't have married two sisters. Then Moses will be asked, take and bless. And even he can't do it. I cannot bless because I was not privileged to enter the land either in life or in death. So all these patriarchal figures in Israel can't lead the Messianic banquet. Then Joshua will be asked, take and bless. I cannot bless, he will reply, because I was not privileged to have a son. Then David will be asked, take and bless. And he says, I will bless, and it is fitting for me to bless. He will reply, as it is said, I will lift up the cup of salvation and call upon the name of the Lord. Now, I realize that's kind of very long, but here's the connection when we think about this parallel. The coming banquet is clearly eschatological, just as it is in the rabbinic text, so is it in the gospel text. The coming banquet will take place at the resurrection of the dead, at the resurrection of the dead, after they have risen, the coming banquet is implicitly messianic. None of the patriarchs or even Moses or Joshua are able to host the banquet. Only the Davidic Messiah could host the banquet. Only the Davidic king, the Messianic king, can host the banquet. Now these I took from a great article by Brant Petrie called Jesus, the Messianic Banquet and the Kingdom of God. Well, so what do we know? The Passover banquet was no mere farewell banquet between Jesus and his disciples, which is sort of how people usually treat it. It's like, I'm going to leave you guys, I'm going to die and go to heaven, but let's have one good meal. But it's so much more than that. The Passover was a prophetic sign of the anticipated Messianic banquet. The Passover was a foretaste of a great eschatological meal. So, in other words, when Jesus is just like we see in these rabbinic texts, when Jesus was celebrating the Lord's Supper, celebrating the Passover, they were acting out the future Messianic banquet in the age to come. In the Hebrew Bible, prophetic signs affect what they signify. They are not, in other words, they are not merely symbolic, they're also efficacious, says N.T. Wright. As N.T. Wright puts it, they have prophetic power. Now, as I've said before, N.T. Wright is pretty brilliant on these observations, but he still comes up short because he recognizes all these things, but he still says that God dumped Israel. So that's another discussion. Well, Jesus, the important point is this: Jesus performs a prophetic sign of both the coming of the kingdom and the eschatological banquet. So that when they're sitting in the upper room that night, he is invoking through these symbols the coming eschatological banquet. I can't stress enough how really profound that is. When you get married, for those of you that have gotten married or will get married, when you say "I do," that's and you're standing under the chuppah or in a church and you put the ring on the finger. That's a pretty symbolic event. You're not merely, and when you say, when the person officiating the ceremony says, "Do you take?" and this person, and you say, "I do," you're not just saying something, you're doing something. And that's the idea. The Messianic meal that Jesus celebrated with the disciples wasn't just saying something, it was actually doing something. Okay, so what else? Well, the third point is the restoration of Israel. All right, so the allusion in Matthew 26 is to the eschatological banquet, which depicts the consummation of the Messianic kingdom in terms of a joyful celebration. Again, going back to Isaiah chapter 25. The Messianic kingdom comes to fruition with the return of the righteous remnant to the land of Israel and the pilgrimage of the Gentile nations to Israel. So this is a huge symbolic image that this event is triggering: the return of Israel to the promised land, along with the Gentiles who bring them back to the promised land. So the presence of the 12 disciples at the Last Supper is pretty significant. The presence of the 12 is just not an incidental fact, which a lot of people sort of miss. It was an eschatological sign of the restoration of the 12 tribes of Israel. So Jesus is acting out the Messianic banquet, and he's brought the 12 disciples with him who represent the restored 12-tribe kingdom of Israel in the age to come. Now, like other Jews, Jesus and his followers believed that the 12 tribes would be gathered to the Messianic banquet. Jesus celebrated the Last Supper, the Passover, as a prophetic sign of the restoration of Israel. So Matthew forges a link between the 12 tribes, the restoration of Israel, and discipleship in Matthew 19:28. Jesus said to them, "Truly I say to you, in the new world," or in, the Greek word is palingenesia, which is kind of hard to translate. It's the new world, the new age, the regeneration of all things. Truly I say to you, in the new world, when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. In other words, that in the age to come, the 12 disciples will govern the restored 12 tribe kingdom. Now, people who don't like what this text appears to say, well, he doesn't mean judging like the judges of Israel. He means like judging them and condemning them to hell, judgment at the end of time. Now, that's not really much of a reward to the disciples. Think of that life well spent, preaching the gospel and sharing the good news and suffering with Jesus. And what's their reward? They get to send their brethren to hell. That's not what this text is saying. He's talking about them acting as governors over the restored 12 tribe kingdom of Israel. Now, in Luke's account, we find a very explicit link, even more than Matthew, which kills me because I want Matthew to have all the good stuff, but I have to admit, I really like Luke's. In Luke's account, we find a very explicit link forged between the 12 tribes, the restoration of Israel, and the Messianic banquet, which is, of course, our subject today. So here we read, Jesus says, "You are those who have stayed with me in my trials, and I assign to you, as my Father assigned to me, a kingdom, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel." So here we see even more clearly than in Matthew, where the disciples are sitting on thrones, judging, ruling over, governing the 12 nations, and participating with Jesus in the Messianic banquet in the age to come. And of course, Gentiles are present at the banquet as well. And we read, for example, in these texts, the Lord of hosts will make for, again, going back to Isaiah, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food. He will swallow up the covering that is cast over all peoples, the veil that is spread over all nations. So throughout the prophets, you see this combination of the restoration of Israel, the Messianic banquet, and the Gentiles as well joining in the celebration. So this idea that people say that in terms of the quote, the church age is a completely new thing. It's not a new thing at all. In the Hebrew Bible, it is filled with the idea that in the Messianic era, God would gather the Gentiles to the kingdom, and he would do it by restoring Israel to the land. They would bring the Jews back to the land from exile. And the Lord of hosts will wipe away tears from all faces. So that's a pretty messianic and cool thing. All right, so table fellowship in the kingdom symbolizes, here's the point, symbolizes the nation's eschatological restoration. The Last Supper was a symbolic act, a foretaste of the fellowship meal that awaited the faithful remnant in the kingdom of Israel. So, yes, absolutely. When we celebrate the Lord's Supper, the Passover, the Eucharist, whatever name people associate with it, yes, of course, we are celebrating the forgiveness of sin and the redemption that we will experience on an individual level. But the story, the gospel, isn't just functioning on a micro level focused on us. It isn't just about us. It's actually functioning on a macro level about God's kingdom, restoring Israel and gathering the nations into God's kingdom. That's really what's unfolding when we're celebrating the Passover meal, when we're celebrating the Last Supper. That's the idea. The forgiveness of sin, the reversal of judgment, the end of exile, the restoration of Zion, the conversion of the Gentiles, and the consummation of God's kingdom were all themes bound up in that event. So, if it wasn't so late, I would be sort of getting all worked up and having a sort of a hallelujah breakdown, as they say, because this is the heart of the gospel. This is late for me. This is the heart of the gospel story. The regathering of God's people to the land. Why can they be regathered to the land? Because the Messiah has wiped away the pollution of their sin. The land has been purified. They can be restored because their hearts have been purified. And the nations also will sing how God redeems Israel. They too will respond and become participants in God's kingdom. So the kingdom is inaugurated at the Passover / Last Supper, but it is not yet completed and will not be completed until Jesus drinks again in the kingdom. All right, so last major theme, we'll probably get done a little early, maybe for once. The blood of the covenant. Matthew 26, continuing. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. By the way, before I go on, does anybody have any questions or comments?
Yeah, I'd like to ask you, the restoration of Israel, that's slide number 54. The forgiveness of sin, the reversal. Well, anyway, would you say that this is basically what redemption means in our context? The forgiveness of sin, the reversal of judgment, the end of exile, the restoration of Zion, and the consummation of God's kingdom.
Yeah, would I say this is what did you say? Would I say it is
redemption?
Yes, absolutely. This is redemption. So it is not this narrow idea that we think about in terms of, us individually, which is what is sort of traditional evangelical theology. It is much larger than that. Now, that's not taking away anything from this idea of individual salvation. It is very important. I underline that. But what's actually unfolding in the story is much bigger than just us. It is about God's kingdom being brought to fruition. So these are just huge themes. Why was Israel cast into exile? From the very beginning, it was because of their covenant disobedience. Already in Deuteronomy, God says, you're going to go into exile. They don't even get the law yet, and they're already, informed that they're going to screw it up. But they make a mess of it. And because of that defilement, the land is polluted. And so God says, just like I kicked all the other nations out of the land, I will remove you from the land. Of course, that's what happens several times. But in the Messianic age, God will remedy that situation by purifying the hearts of his people. And thus, he's able to purify the land, bringing about the return to Zion, the forgiveness of sin, this triggers the salvation of the Gentiles as well. So that's the big picture. Yeah, absolutely. Good question. Very good. Thank you. Okay, anyone else before I go on? I know I
Yeah,
kind of shot through this
hello.
very fast. Go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, about the poured out for many. I've heard people talk about that a lot. Why it doesn't say poured out for all, the blood of the covenant, but poured out for many. What can you say about that?
Well, let's see. I think we're going to come to more of that in a minute, but I'll just briefly say that, the many are, I don't have to, it would take a little bit of time to unpack all that now. It's a good question, but in the scripture, the many is often referred to as the many of those who, in terms of Israel, those who believe, in terms of the remnant. But what was the other option that you suggested for it? Sorry.
No, there was not. The all. Why isn't the blood poured out for all? Because we're taught that Jesus died for all, but here it says for the many, for many. So
Yeah, well, he's using language, for one, he's using language from the Tanakh, from the Hebrew Bible. We see, because God talks about or the prophets talk about what God is doing in terms of the many. But I think that is language, sort of encrypted language, talking about in context about those in Israel who will repent and believe and be redeemed. But I don't know if you're thinking in terms of later theological debates, in terms of.
no, that's good. That's good that it's really about Israel at that point. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's what clarified for me.
yeah, I think that's the
About
point.
many in Israel.
Yeah. So I would say that is what he is saying. It's language referring to that the many in Israel who will respond and become, this purified remnant. Now there's layers to that. There's more to it, but I think that's the gist of it.
No,
Yes, sir.
what you're saying. I really enjoy it because it reminds me of what it says in Romans 11 and talking to the Gentiles, saying that the rejection of Israel may have allowed you to be grafted in, but what is their return going to be? What a joyful thing that's going to be! It's going to be so much better for those of us that are Gentiles because Israel comes back.
Yeah, right. Exactly. You're exactly right. Yeah, good point.
I think that's really cool.
Yeah, that is. Thanks for sharing that. That's a good observation. But I have to say, and I know I'm a broken record on this point, but so many New Testament scholars do not engage it on that level. Sadly, many others do, but many don't. They sort of miss that point, which I think is so clear.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I've heard before, but this idea, to me, when you're reading through the scripture, to think that in the end, all this failure and all this stuff that you saw happening is all going to come back. Israel's going to come back, and then we're going to be able to have a part in it. I mean, that's just it's exciting to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, exactly. And the prophets talk about the Gentiles, the nations will see what God is doing and they will bring the Jews back to the land. That's all the imagery that's being triggered here in this event, when they are celebrating the Passover meal. Now, specifically in the context of that night, Jesus is enacting the Passover with the focus on Israel, but it is broader than that. And of course, we see that as the gospel goes out to the nations and find its ultimate manifestation in terms of all the nations becoming part of the Messianic kingdom.
Well, it's going to make my meditation at the Lord's Supper much richer than it was before. Thank you.
Oh yeah, you're welcome. Cool. That's very good. All right, cool. Good. Thanks. All right. Great question. Anybody else before we go on?
You have some things in the chat. I don't know if you've seen yet.
I haven't. Sorry. Thanks for letting me know.
Sure.
Okay, let's see. let's see. Brooklyn says, this may be opening a can of worms, but will you consider talking about the conversion of the Gentile means? Yes, Brooklyn, that is a can of worms. Simply a belief in Yeshua as a Messiah, more than that. Okay, good question. Yeah, that's a can of worms. But it can mean, at a minimum, the Gentiles embracing the Messiah of Israel. I don't think that the Gentiles are compelled to become Jews. That would sort of defeat the purpose of what the rest of the New Testament says about that. But there are Gentiles who do embrace sort of a Messianic lifestyle. And I don't think that's necessarily wrong. It's wrong if Gentiles do it because they feel inferior as Gentiles. I think that's absolutely wrong. But it can be more, in other words, it can be more than simply accepting the Messiah. But at a minimum, it definitely means Gentiles embracing Jesus on their own terms, understanding who he was as the Messiah of Israel and following him. But that does not necessarily mean that they have to follow a Jewish lifestyle, although there are those who would debate that point. Did that answer your question, Brooklyn?
Yes, thank you.
Sure. What were you thinking? Did you have a point on that?
Just back to the previous slide that was talking about all of the different things that the eschatological age brings with it, trying to put those pieces together and see where the whole kingdom of God comes into play.
Well, yeah. It's using this broad language. So, in the details, it gets even more complicated to work out. But, we see that happening in terms of the New Testament once the gospel goes out and we see the nations responding. Now, unfortunately, what happens is that by the 2nd century, the ecclesia, the congregation, has become dominated by Gentiles, and they actually begin forcing out the Jewish members of the ecclesia, or they send them underground, if I can put it that way. But what I would say is when you see this new entity, this sort of spirit-filled pneumatological entity, in other words, the ecclesia, quote unquote, the church, although that's not the best title, being established, it starts out well with these Gentiles becoming members of the kingdom, but soon enough, they will turn on their Jewish brothers, sadly. And at least by the 4th century, the Messianic wing of the ecclesia is invisible. We don't see them present at any of these quote unquote church councils. I think the church would have looked like a very different creature if this outbreak of, what can I say? This outbreak of Christian anti-Semitism very early on had not taken root, but it did. And it's interesting, at the very first council, the Council of Nicaea, well, it's actually not the first council, the one in Jerusalem was, but anyway, there were no Jewish leaders present. There were only Gentile leaders, because by that time, they've been, ironically, to carry the metaphor on, pushed away from the table. And so Gentiles from then on will define what the ecclesia looks like. Now that in this modern age, we see a little bit of that changing, but that tension is still going on. Great question. Let's see, and Tan asks, the reversal of judgment reminds me of the curse of mankind at once, when Adam and Eve disobeyed God and when they were expelled off the Garden of Eden. Thanks be to God, because of Jesus willingly sacrificing for our sins, there is a reversal of judgment and we are redeemed and restored. Well, that preaches, absolutely, you're right. That's the idea. So, and all this drives actually back to the story of to the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve are exiled from the garden, and the the story ends with a return to an Edemic state in a way, without losing the features that have been added to the story. What a lot of, I think, Bible teachers want to do is end the story by saying all these things that God has developed, that sort of washes away, and we're back and just sitting in a garden with no differentiation and identity and all that stuff. But I don't think that's how it's working. But excellent observation. Okay, good. All right, great questions. Thanks for reminding me. Okay, good. Anyone else? Okay, good discussion. I know that I sort of zoomed through this a little fast, and I didn't mean to do that. But my goal is that as a result of our discussion, when you do celebrate the Last Supper or the Lord's table or the Eucharist, whatever term is part of your tradition, that you'd see it as more than just this event that takes place to establish, the memorial of Jesus' death. And and I don't mean that the way it sounded. I mean, we usually say that, but we're just thinking about us individually. But it's so much bigger than us individually. We are part of what God is doing, but it is his kingdom that is being established. And I should say this, among biblical theologians, this is a big debate about what did Jesus' death accomplish? Did it establish? Was the main point to establish God's kingdom? Was it penal atonement? Now I've just jumped off the rails, but these are the theological questions that crop up, hundreds of years later in this discussion. In evangelical Christianity, unless you say the words substitutionary penal atonement as being the main purpose of Jesus's death, it's like you're being cast in the outer darkness. But it was not actually that way for most of church history. For the early period of church history, the focus was on Jesus defeating the power of Satan and establishing God's kingdom. Later, this idea of the stress upon penal substitution became sort of the watchword of the part of the Protestant Reformation. And it's like sort of a test of orthodoxy for a lot of people, whether you say that is what it's all about. But historically, it was not that way. It was a focus on God's kingdom and the defeat of Satan and all of those things that were wrapped into it. So it's a huge discussion. Great. Good questions. Thanks for your input. Okay, so getting back to our discussion about the blood of the covenant, what is that about? All right, so again, Jesus said, "For this is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Again, not taking anything away from the idea of the forgiveness of sins. It does set us free. I tell you, I will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it with you in my Father's kingdom. Usually we sort of read right over that. It doesn't nearly have that much oomph to it because we're thinking usually along this very narrow line of our individual need for redemption. All right, well, so the blood of the covenant seals the union between God and the people. So what is he talking about, though? Is it the Mosaic covenant? Or is he talking about the new covenant? Let's see. I think someone's mic is on, so check your mics, please. Thanks. All right, so is he talking about the new covenant in Jeremiah 31? Is that what he means? Or the Mosaic covenant? Or is it both? I usually take the both answer because it's the easy answer. But it may be right. Well, what's the background of the Mosaic covenant here? Well, there are two types of sacrifices which bring the covenant into being. There's the whole burnt offering, the challah. We get the word Holocaust from this idea of the whole burnt offering. The idea is that the death of the Jewish people during World War II was a sacrifice consumed by God during this time. Anyway, behind this event is the whole burnt offering, and where the entire animal was sacrificed so that it may ascend to God as a sacrifice. And what did that do? The blood functioned. This is a little crass, but the blood of the sacrifice functions as a spiritual detergent to remove the ritual impurity from God's dwelling place that you have inflicted upon it. People, when they talk, they think, oh, I'm such a sinner, I'm a sinner. Well, you are a sinner, that's very true, but that's not the problem, is that your sinfulness has sort of wafted over and polluted God's dwelling place and defiled it. It's sort of like, think of a smokestack in the blood and somebody's drawing on my screen. Don't do that.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah,
All right.
I don't know what I did.
That's okay. Let's see. I think, let's see. Can I erase that?
Oops.
Don't worry about it. I'll fix it later. Don't worry about it. We are defiling here. I think I can get rid of it here. Let me see. Oh, here it is. Don't worry. Anyway, not a big deal. I'll fix it later. It'll stop when I turn off the screen. All right. So anyway, yes, the point is our individual sin has sort of defiled everything. All right. So the burnt offering affects or brings about atonement. The second offering is the shalom or the shalomim offering. The fellowship sacrifice. So you offered the first sacrifice to remove the impurity that you've defiled God's dwelling place with. And once you've done that, you're able to have a fellowship meal with him. So the sacrifice established a communal relationship between God and the people partaking in the sacrificial meal. On the one hand, Matthew equates Jesus's death specifically with the Mosaic covenantal sacrifice, not the Passover sacrifice, which is sort of interesting. However, Jesus still reenacted the sacrifice during the Passover meal, which triggers an additional level of interpretation of his death. I know that's sort of like getting into the weeds, but when we think about what's actually going on, that's what's going on. When he's talking about the blood of the covenant and all that, that isn't actually Passover stuff, but he's still, sort of playing the story out. So Anders Runeson writes this. He says, just as the blood of the Paschal lambs protected the people of Israel as God sent destruction and death over Egypt to liberate his people, Jesus' death will serve as protection when the apocalyptic disaster marking the beginning of the end are unleashed, as foretold in Matthew 24. So, in other words, there's stuff happening on a eschatological level here already as they celebrate the Passover meal. He is putting his people under the protection of his sacrifice. All right, anyway, that's the Mosaic background. But then the question is it a reference to the new covenant? In the other Gospels, Jesus' statement includes the word the new covenant, but not in Matthew. Matthew just has the word covenant, because I think he's definitely trying to stress the Mosaic link. But that doesn't mean I would necessarily say there's no new covenant link to it here. Chapters 30 and 33 of Jeremiah form a literary unit which focuses upon the restoration of Israel and the return of the Jewish people to their homeland. The new covenant is announced in verses 31 through 34. The Torah of Moses gave people the ability to know what was right, but it lacked the capacity to enable people to do what is right. That's always my problem. I know the right thing to do, but I don't have the ability to do it, or at least that's my excuse. So Jeremiah says, or because of their failure to keep the conditions of the Mosaic covenant, the people of God suffered judgment and ultimately exile, the ultimate punish for persistent covenant disobedience. In response to the situation, the Lord declares that, quote, days are coming when he will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. In response to the situation, the Lord declares that, quote, days are coming when he will make a new covenant. I just said that, sorry, with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Now, behind this allusion is the idea that Jesus comes as a new Moses to offer a sacrifice on behalf of the people so that they might enter into a covenant with God. Just as the blood of the sacrificed animals ratified the covenant between God and Israel, so the blood of Jesus ratifies the covenant anew through his sacrificial death. So, well, there you have it. It is just all these themes woven together. Let me stop sharing and we can talk a bit.
When you say in response to the situation, do you mean exile? Is that the situation?
Yes, and everything that comes after that. So, from the perspective of Israel, what has happened? Israel's persistent sin and disobedience has defiled the land. What will happen when you defile the land? As we said a moment ago, God's wrath will break out upon you unless you remedy the situation. And so the ultimate, according to the Deuteronomic curses, the ultimate punishment for covenant disobedience was removal from the land. And so the death of Jesus purifies the presence of God from the defilement of Israel's uncleanness. It purifies the land, so God's wrath is withdrawn. The land has been purified. Israel can again be restored to it. So that's the idea. These are all the themes that are operating behind the story. Excellent question. Good question. Anyone else?
This is a whole big thing, but I've really come to my attention of late how the church, the particular church I attend, has totally missed the idea that the Lord has not abandoned Israel. The church is not the new Israel. Why has this become such a stronghold teaching amidst the Reformed Church, the evangelical church? Why are they missing this piece? What is your thought?
Well, it's a good question, but it's not just the evangelical church, and there are many evangelicals that don't miss it. There's some, very committed Christians who, strongly support God's program for Israel. I think even they, though, can miss what's going on sometimes. I've had a lot of Christians who, they love Israel, but they love it mostly as a theological peg for the future. The Israel of the here and now, the flesh and blood Israel, is not, it can even offend them on some level. It feels uncomfortable. If Jesus came back today, they are sure that he would go to their church instead of to a synagogue where he would have normally fit in. But but that said, your point still stands, that the church has missed this and sort of denied Israel's place. But this begins early on. Again, as I said earlier, going back to the Council of Nicaea, in the 4th century, we've already started excluding Israel from the story. And this comes out of need to explain to themselves how they share in these promises that God gave to Israel. Because they said to themselves, well, God has made all these fantastic promises, and if Israel has any role in it, then this can't be about us. So, it's like winner takes all was the idea. So they sort of remove Israel from the equation, and it was, the level of anti-Semitism was high, to put it mildly. And so it's just survived in different forms throughout history. Religious Semitism, anti-Semitism died down eventually, but it's replaced by a new type of anti-Semitism in every age. In fact, today, right now, literally right now, we're experiencing yet the newest form of anti-Semitism in terms of this anti-Zionism and this absolute hatred of Israel right now. So, so it's a easy answer and a hard answer all at the same time.